And now I'd like to introduce Daniel Dumbrill, who is joining us actually from China. Daniel, you recently visited Xinjiang and spoke to all kinds of locals from the area and documented a lot of this on your personal YouTube page. And you've been doing a lot of work to uncover what is actually happening. I think the audience is eager to hear your remarks around this issue. So thank you so much for speaking with us and joining us today. I'll pass over the mic to you.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, thanks for that intro, and thanks for having me here today. Definitely, I made a trip recently to Xinjiang and started to post some things on my YouTube channel for everybody to see. There's a bunch of other stuff coming as well, and other experiences that would probably come out in a conversation format like this. Now, for today, I was originally planning on speaking about that recent trip to Xinjiang and talking about the things I saw. It was a great trip. I got to see a lot and speak to many people on my own. I spoke to not only people who had positive things to say, but also negative things about China and the government. But I found myself getting a bit burnt out. When you go to Xinjiang looking for evidence of a genocide and approaching it this way, eventually you get to a point where, to be frank, you start feeling like an idiot. When I went to Xinjiang, I didn't want to go in with any sort of a bias. I wanted to see if I could find something that perhaps I had not been looking for. I wanted to see something. I wanted to see the situation from the perspective of somebody who really believes there's a genocide going on in Xinjiang. And to accomplish that best, I reached out to multiple anti-China voices, one of whom could probably be considered one of the top 10 loudest voices on this matter. I won't mention his name because we did agree to keep our private conversations confidential, but I collected information from them on what to look for, what to ask for, where to go, asking for specific coordinates as well, and took a look at Xinjiang from their perspective. At first, it was interesting to try and look at my surroundings from their perspective. And after a certain point, as I said, you start to feel like an idiot. Take, for example, being asked to check a children's bookstore, because apparently I won't find any Uyghur children's books. Not only did I find a wide selection of Uyghur children's books, and even a Uyghur translation of Henry Kissinger's book in the grown-up section, but if I wanted Chinese, simplified Chinese or English children's books, I had to go up to the second floor in a far-off corner to find them. I decided to film the children's book section, the Uyghur children's book section, and the Uyghur staff started shouting at me and saying, I'm not allowed to film. And I asked, is this some sort of a government rule? To which they replied, no, this is our bookstore rule. We don't want our competition having our layout and all of our book details. And I explained that I'm not from Kashgar and that there are rumors overseas that Uyghur children's books are not allowed, that they're banned. After the staff gave me a strange look, they said, okay, fine, in a way that seemed to express, okay, buddy, whatever you say, probably whispering to each other after, that these foreigners are really strange, reconfirming my feeling that I was acting like an idiot. The next step after graduating from feeling interested to feeling like an idiot was anger. When you start to meet ordinary locals and you realize that many of them have a small plot of family village land where they grow cotton. And when you hear stories of women whose family status increased and leverage in the family, especially in abusive relationships, their status went up because of their opportunities to work and improve their own personal quality of life. You suddenly start to realize after you hear these stories that the U.S. isn't out to help these people. They're out to destroy them. Their sanctions are designed to do what sanctions were always designed to do, and what they've almost always accomplished: make ordinary people on the ground suffer and feel discontent. Couple that with America's delisting of ETIM as a terrorist organization, which is allowing them to raise funds and recruit now, and the very obvious fact that recruitment in an environment of unemployment is far easier, as was observed in many other places, especially with Al-Qaeda's recruitment drive in Iraq after it was destabilized. To me, it's obvious what they're trying to do. This is exactly why there's a desperate attempt to sanction as many products as possible from Xinjiang, or factories who hire Uyghur, not because there's any actual solid evidence to support the forced or slave labor claims, but because they want to destroy the economies that Uyghurs rely on and scare other companies in China out of hiring Uyghur workers, fearing accusations that they'll receive. This is done to undo China's progress in its most important successes they achieved in their anti-terrorism efforts. America's out to do the same thing they did in the last Cold War, try to achieve their geopolitical goals through terrorism. Destroying Xinjiang's progress and pushing locals back into poverty is not an unfortunate consequence. It's the actual target. While discussing his book, The Art of Sanctions, Richard Nephew admitted that sanctions were designed to destroy economies and specifically mentioned to drive up unemployment in the regions of target. Richard now works with President Biden. I'm still glad that I reached out to these anti-China personalities to take this approach. I'm a firm believer in the idea of deliberately seeking out information to prove your own conclusions or positions wrong. And that's what I want to briefly focus on here, especially because so many people have firmly made up their minds already. And therefore, many of those people wouldn't even believe a single thing I said about what I experienced in Xinjiang anyways. In reality, what should really be going on, rather than having people continually trying to debunk outrageous claims, is the people making those claims should be expected to provide compelling evidence to prove it. But we're just not seeing that. This is why when the US State Department lawyers were pushed on the topic, they were forced to admit there's no evidence to support the idea of a genocide in Xinjiang. And this is why the International Criminal Court doesn't feel the evidence is sufficient either. They probably see the circular nature of so much of this evidence. For example, creating the claim that the Uyghur population is being genocided through birth control. The first step is to get a witness testimony, no matter how filled with contradictions and critical holes, to say that they were forcefully sterilized, or more accurately, had removable IUD placements forced on them. Next is to create a deliberately misleading translation or translations of Chinese documents to look like family planning efforts targeted minorities more than anyone else, and added in a few creative assumptions. A quick side note, some of those testimonies actually even put Neria's fake 1990 testimony used to promote war to shame. Everyone also overlooks that many of these witnesses are posing with East Turkestan flags, problematic and revealing for a number of reasons that I won't get into today. Anyway, thereafter, they search in a selective way for specific data that wouldn't normally support the idea of genocide anywhere else, but now they decide it does, because this is what they're hoping to find. They, for example, grab official Chinese government birth statistics and say, look at that remarkable drop. When someone points out that's fairly characteristic, a characteristic drop in any rapidly developing society, or say, as a matter of fact, even Japan had a bigger drop than that in the 80s during their economic ascent, they reject what these drops have always meant in favor of what they're hoping to say it means. So now the data must mean genocide because it lines up with the narratives, and now the narratives must be true because the data has been twisted to say so. Both of these, both the shoddy narrative and the shoddy interpretation of the data sets mean nothing on its own, but for some reason, when combined, it creates a compelling enough story to declare genocide. But what I'd like to do now is encourage people to take the same approach that I did, and I think we should all do on any topic. Actively seek out evidence to prove your own position wrong. Don't continually seek to prove your own bias correct. Look for red flags and ask yourself critical questions. What I'll simply do from this point here is pose a few questions to you. You may be able to find the answers to them, but I want to give you or you may already know some of the answers to them, but I want to give you an idea about some of the questions you should be asking yourself in order to help create a framework or a point of view to work from. I will offer some of my own answers, but you can look for your own as well, of course. I'll also add in some context about the overall big picture by highlighting some of those red flags I said you should be looking for. First of all, let's look at this with motive in mind. Is there a motive to genocide the Uyghurs? If it's to erase their culture, they seem to be doing a lot of counterproductive things, from language support, celebrating their culture on national stages, and so on and so on. There's been no national attempt to villainize this group like we've seen in actual real historical genocides. Even compare that to Israel, where the hatred between groups is palpable, and perhaps worth noting has more evidence of atrocities in a single week than we've had for years of focus on Xinjiang, even with millions of dollars poured into the narrative. Challenging all these different possible obscure motives that anyone could come up with isn't something I'm going to do now. Once again, I just want to point you in the right direction. Let me ask a much simpler question, one where the answer is exceedingly obvious, at least from my point of view. For this, we've got to follow the money, and the money is overwhelmingly coming from one specific place. With that in mind, does America, the number one state funder of the Xinjiang genocide narrative, have a motive to fabricate these stories? Yes, absolutely, without any doubt. China's rise is something that threatens the US for so many reasons. It threatens their global hegemony. It threatens the US dollar as the world's global currency, something that America gains a lot of power from. And it threatens their brutal hold over the global South countries that America has terrorized and exploited for over 100 years. This is no longer about just attacking a single country in the Middle East with fabricated lies for the purpose of maintaining control over a single region, like we all know they do. This is now about maintaining control over the entire world. So imagine how much more effort is going to be put into this. This is also exactly why the plan for $300 million per year in anti-China propaganda targeting the Belt and Road Initiative was recently put forward. America wants to derail China and convince the world that China is so unethical, no one should work with them. And it's an important part of America's manic and panicked scramble to remain number one. Ask yourself, if this is all fabricated, why Xinjiang? To me, the answer is pretty obvious for this one too. It's located in the key doorway for China's Belt and Road Initiative. It's a place that had social unrest and terrorism issues that could easily be exploited. And the US attempts in Hong Kong already flopped, but they certainly tried hard by supporting the rioters and even sending over US senators to walk around in the streets and encourage them. This literally happened, which, by the way, you don't have to imagine too hard what the reaction would be if Chinese Communist Party leaders did the same thing in reverse when the Capitol Hill riots were going on. All right, so we have a clear motive and an opportunity here. Does America actually lie, though? Do they create fake human rights atrocities for their own selfish geopolitical interests? Do they also manage to trick and convince most of the rest of the world as well? Well, yes, of course, absolutely. Remember that example of the Niera testimony I gave you? That's just one of many. You can go through the other obvious ones, like the weapons of mass destruction, the dishwashing powder that Colin Powell held up at the UN and said was anthrax, and the list of false flag attacks that go on and on. We've even actually already exposed lies in relation to China. Declassified documents showed that when the US government said China was interfering in the most recent set of US elections, it was completely fabricated. There was no evidence of this. Do you think the US is suddenly going to stop lying now, both in a general sense and more specifically in relation to China? I mean, no, of course not. This is just starting to heat up. Does the American government truly care about human rights abuses? From a big picture point of view, on an international scale? No, not really, especially not when it's them or their allies committing those abuses. This is exactly why America says they'd like the world to follow a rules-based order, carefully avoiding the words international law. In a rules-based world, they make the rules and other people follow them. So we've established that America has the motive, the means through funding, the opportunity, and a clear track record of doing this kind of stuff. They've been caught over and over again doing this stuff. Does this mean human rights abuses aren't happening in Xinjiang? America's clear benefit from getting people to believe this story doesn't automatically make it untrue. However, their involvement, combined with a lack of real physical evidence, despite generous funding, is important context to understand the big picture and stay alert. Sometimes America's geopolitical interests do line up with real human rights issues, but understanding the dynamics at play here, remembering how many times you've been tricked with similar narratives before, and understanding the criminal nature of the American government's foreign policy is extremely important context. People often criticize me for talking about the American government so much, but this is absolutely relevant. If there was someone fabricating this narrative with malicious intent, America is the prime suspect here. We should absolutely be looking at them and remembering the lessons of yesterday in terms of what it means when America suddenly cares this much about human rights abuses, and especially when we consider that the funding for this narrative has America's name all over it. People are willing to say, sometimes people are willing to say, well, you know what, we don't really have evidence of genocide here, but it sounds like something China would do. So let's just assume it's true for the time being. Well, with that logic in mind, you'd be even more justified to say we should probably assume America is lying through their teeth yet again. Some people overlook this because they believe preventing China's rise is something that is necessary, so necessary that they're willing to engage in intellectual dishonesty and believe in something that might not really be true in order to accomplish a greater good. At least get yourself to a point where you can admit to yourself that this is what's going on. It's a baby step towards recognizing that the reason you felt comfortable with your intellectual dishonesty in the first place is also because of a second layer of propaganda. The Chinese government has never acted or expressed quite like America has, that they want to dominate the entire world, as you've been led to believe. Despite your belief that all superpowers act the same, we have enough information to see from China's current and past actions, they will not go around overthrowing governments like America does. They don't talk about their superior political and economic system quite like America constantly does either, who often even pushes their way onto the world by military force. But this is getting a little off topic. I'm just trying to illustrate that when it comes to China, you are buried under layers and layers of propaganda. Try to break free from this. You've had enough lessons about what happens when you're uncritical of Western state-sponsored narratives. You allow yourself to be fooled over and over again, acting just as surprised each time, and yet still returning to a, well, maybe they're telling the truth this time, state of sleep yet again. Let's take this first step, though. Recognize that there's a reason for concern with the narrative, regardless of how you feel about China. Put that aside for the purposes of intellectual honesty and self-respect for just a moment. I'm telling you now, if you do this in an honest way, you're going to be blown away by what you find on every China-related topic, from the Hong Kong protests to the Sri Lanka port propaganda, to the groups behind the organ harvesting stories, to the groups training Uyghur children in Syria with military equipment, and of course, to the true story of Xinjiang. You'll suddenly wonder why, in what's being painted as a Holocaust of epic scale, you were so uncritical about the fact that there's no refugee crisis. And the few people that escaped, who are being propped up by American politicians as survivors of the Chinese concentration camps, were there where they were brutally beaten and tortured and escaped genocide and escaped China on their passports legally, exiting through China exit customs and immigration. You're not going to be able to fully comprehend how ridiculous this is until we get past that first step I've been talking about. There's a whole world of information that your bias has shut you off from, and a whole world of perspective to better understand some of the recent reactions from China as well, in events like the Alaska meeting, for example, and beyond. I'm not going to give away much more than this, and you shouldn't listen to me anyways. When you go on this journey on your own, when you discover this stuff on your own, it's so much more fascinating, valuable, and rewarding to the entire way you think about these issues and narratives in the future. And in the process, it's far more useful in order to better equip yourself to avoid being fooled again, no matter what the topic ends up being. In closing, I want to say, if all of this isn't motive enough to take a couple of steps back, even for just a few moments, in order to take a look at what's happening around you, consider what happened with your complacency in previous American-led propaganda campaigns. Maybe some people don't really care because the consequences were for innocent people on the other side of the world that they don't know and they've never met. They didn't know their names then, and they don't know their names now. But we're in a whole different ball game here today, though. Look at the language being used by America and its allies, especially Australia. Look at what they've been promoting and look at what they've been doing. We're getting closer and closer to requiring one small spark to set off something that will have consequences for all of us this time. And thank you for listening. That's it for me.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel, for your extremely illuminating remarks. I think your explanation, especially of the geopolitical and the economic context, really helps people who don't really know about the issue, who really don't know anything about what's going on, from a wider lens, right? You begin to see the patterns of these claims of human rights violations really as a precursor to war. And I think the last point you made of think about really the casualties of war, the human lives that are at stake. And also really appreciate the questions you pose to the audience, and hope that folks do take those questions seriously and explore those answers with a critical analysis.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to do it. Is just take a step back, because the propaganda that's coming out is kind of like whack-a-mole. A new claim comes up, and you can only debunk so many of them, and many of them have been debunked. So the better thing for people to do is just to take a step back and start asking critical questions, I believe. So yeah.